The Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas by me, Julissa Livingstone. Something interesting about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Before we have learned about the Louisiana Purchase, and a lot of people may not have knew this, but who knew that the Louisiana Purchase tied in with the Kansas-Nebraska Act? Land-wise, the Nebraska Territory was within the purchased land that was bought from Thomas Jefferson. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 was established by a bill that got the okay to be passed. However, full support was needed from the South in order for everyone to agree. The full support came from adding on slavery to the bill. This act took place within the area of the Louisiana Purchase. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was a dividing of two territories. The separate territories is what now makes the states Kansas and Nebraska. An establishment of something doesn't particularly start out of nowhere. Previous problems or situations lead up to a main event. In this case, the Fugitive Slave Act and the Uncle Tom's Cabin brought attention amongst people who agreed with both in the North, but the Fugitive Slave Act and Uncle Tom's Cabin was a dislike in the South. The tension between the two brought conflicts. The North and the South never agreed with each other. This is because they never agreed on slavery. As conflicts raised, it started to create a separation in territories, which brings up the Kansas and Nebraska Act with Bleeding Kansas. But these situations weren't the only things that caused this event. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 has a whole history that altogether contains interesting information. This event is more likely the single most significant situation that eventually led up to the Civil War. There are a whole lot of parts and pieces that gave their own role in this act and the violence after. For example, the beginning of the Kansas-Nebraska Act started off from Senator A. Douglas. He was a senator who wanted to divide the Nebraska Territory into two territories. However, a bill needed to be passed with full support. In order to receive full support from the South, Douglas decided and proposed slavery within the areas. With adding slavery onto the list, everything began to move downhill. Because slavery wanted to be a part of the document, the Missouri Compromise would be forgotten. The Missouri Compromise is basically the banning of slavery in certain territories. With slavery being banned from certain territories, that meant that the Nebraska Territory was part of the Missouri Compromise. But that was all going to change. Southerners applauded the non-existence of the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the passing of the bill, while other people were angry with it. The completion of the Kansas-Nebraska Act eventually began Bleeding Kansas, which was from 1855 through 1861. The voting of territorial legislature was an election that pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers hurried into. Pro-slavery settlers were people who supported slavery, while anti-slavery settlers disagreed with the existence of slavery. These different kinds of settlers hated each other, but the people who liked slavery did not want to risk losing the election. An amount of 5,000 Missourians were brought upon and voted illegally. Overall, pro-slavery settlers won the election. However, the anti-slavery settlers were over the official government and began their own in the process. Speeches were thrown back and forth, attacking both sides, but killing was the ultimate result for. They broke out into war and created a reason for the Civil War. The Kansas-Nebraska Act did cause change in the end. The conflicts that were amongst the people and the agreeing and disagreeing of slavery eventually led to a big change in our history, which was the Civil War.